Okay, let's unpack this. Today we are bringing you a deep dive into a really massive, deeply moving compilation of material.
Truly massive.
Right. And it's focused entirely on war poetry. We're going on a journey to trace exactly how humanity has processed the trauma, the fleeting glory, and just the absolute horror of conflict through verse.
And the timeline we're looking at is incredible.
Yeah, we are talking about a timeline that stretches all the way from ancient bards of Greece, singing to huge crowds, right up to modern digital newsletters being published in real time in Ukraine. So welcome to the deep dive.
It is a remarkable stack of history to sort through, for sure. And just to set the stage for you, it is crucial to understand the sheer breadth of what we're actually looking at today. Because when people hear the phrase war poet, the immediate image that jumps to mind is usually...
Like a young guy in a muddy trench.
Exactly. A young soldier shivering in a trench with a notebook. But the reality is so much broader than that. These writers are combatants, absolutely, but they're also field nurses up to their elbows in casualties. They're civilians caught up in the crossfire of besieged cities.
Distant observers, right.
Right, distant observers, just trying to make sense of the geopolitical chaos unfolding around them.
And I want you to think about why this matters to you for a second. Put yourself in the mindset of reading a standard history book. Usually you're getting sterile facts.
Just the data.
Yeah, you get the dates, the movement of troop lines on a map, the grim tally of casualty numbers. It's incredibly distant. But poetry bypasses all of that analytical distance. It gives you the raw, unfiltered emotional reality of those exact moments in history. It puts you right there in the boots of the people who are living through it, breathing the same dust.
It truly serves as an emotional anchor, and we see that right from the very beginning of human civilization, deeply embedded in ancient oral traditions.
So let's start right there at the beginning. You've got Homer's Iliad from around the 8th century BC.
Detailing the siege of Troy, right?
Yeah, the 10-year siege. But what really caught my eye was the Iranian memorial of Zur. This was composed in pre-Islamic Persia.
Oh, that is a fascinating one.
It really is. This epic was kept alive by Zoroastrian priests and sung by traveling minstrels. And these minstrels were an absolute fixture of society back then. They weren't just providing, background entertainment at a banquet.
No. Oh.
This was how an entire culture memorialized its survival. It was how they honored their warriors.
What's fascinating here is how poetry wasn't just reflecting history as this passive, backward-looking record. Sometimes it was active, it was subversive, and it was hiding right in plain sight.
Oh, like the secret codes.
Yes! Take the famous English nursery rhyme, The Queen of Hearts.
The one about baking tarts.
That's the one. You probably remember it from childhood. But historical analysis suggests this innocuous little rhyme is alleged to be a highly coded, thinly veiled political poem.
About a war.
About the outbreak of the 30 Years' War in the 17th century.
Wait, the nursery rhyme about the queen baking tarts is about a 17th century European conflict.
It really is. The King and Queen of Hearts supposedly represent the Elector Palatine, Friedrich V, and his wife, Elizabeth Stuart.
Okay, so where do the tarts come in?
The whole bit about the Queen deciding to bake tarts is actually a coded reference to her persuading her Calvinist husband to accept the Czech nobility's offer to take the throne of Bohemia.
Okay, so if the king and queen are these 17th century royals, who is the knave of hearts? The one who steals the tarts?
That represents the Holy Roman Emperor. The local officials of the emperor were overthrown in a famous palace coup. It's known as the Third Defenestration of Prague.
I have to stop you right there. Defenestration as in literally throwing someone out of a window.
Literally.
And this was the third time they did it.
Yes, it was a whole thing. The Czech nobility literally threw the emperor's Catholic regents out of a third-story window at Prague Castle.
That is insane. Did they survive?
They survived because they landed in a massive pile of manure.
Oh.
Yeah, but it kicked off a massive continental war. So the Queen of Hearts was essentially a secret political commentary disguised as a harmless children's rhyme so people wouldn't be executed for singing it.
That is wild. It really proves poetry was a dangerous, potent tool.
Yeah.
And you actually see examples where poetry literally started wars. Fast forward to the 18th century, and there's the Scottish Gaelic poet Alasdair MacMaster Alistair.
A very influential figure.
Incredibly influential. He was this passionate supporter of the House of Stuart. His Jacobite poems were so fiery and persuasive that they were translated into English and read aloud to Prince Charles Edward Stuart.
Direct to the prince.
Direct to the prince. And those very poems played a major role in convincing the prince to actually initiate the bloody 1745 uprising.
It is a staggering amount of cultural influence for a poet to wield. He quite literally talked a royal into a rebellion.
Which is pretty funny to think about today, considering you can barely convince people to show up for an open mic poetry night, let alone overthrow a monarchy.
That is a very fair point. But contrast that slow, deliberate spread of 18th century Gaelic poems with the sheer speed of how poetry mobilized in the 19th century.
The printing press, right.
Exactly. The industrialization of the printing press changed the game completely. During the Crimean War in 1854, Alfred Lord Tennyson read a newspaper account of a disastrous cavalry charge by British forces.
Right.
Within just a few minutes of reading that grim article, he sat down and wrote, "The Charge of the Light Brigade."
He wrote one of the most famous poems in the English language in just a few minutes.
He did, and because of the printing press, it became this massive sensation almost overnight. It was printed in pamphlet form and shipped out, distributed directly to the troops sitting on the front lines in the Crimea.
Wow. Imagine being a soldier and reading a poem about the battle you are currently fighting in.
It functioned almost exactly like a 19th century viral post. It was this immediate, widespread cultural processing of a military disaster. It turned a horrific tactical blunder into a story of glorious sacrifice.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because that romantic idea of a glorious cavalry charge, you couldn't survive what was coming next. The mechanized meat grinder of the First World War completely broke that tradition.
The Great War changed European literature forever. Up until 1914, war poetry often maintained some thread of individual military glory, virtuous leadership, or noble sacrifice, tracing all the way back to those Homeric traditions we started with.
But the trenches changed all that.
Completely. The sheer unprecedented trauma of modern mechanized warfare, the slaughter of millions of young men by impersonal machine guns and long-range artillery, it completely annihilated those classic tropes. Writers had to struggle to find a totally new vocabulary that could convey the apocalyptic reality they were living through.
And you see that struggle literally breaking the language apart. Take the German expressionist poet August Strahm. The guy treated language like a physical material that was being blown to pieces.
He tore the grammar completely apart.
He pared his syntax down to its absolute bare essentials, completely stripping out standard grammar. He even coined new, jagged words from old ones. He wrote a poem called Baptism by Fire that caused a massive scandal in the German press in 1915.
And the wild part is, it wasn't scandalous because it was overtly unpatriotic.
Right. It was scandalous simply because it was too honest.
Strahm absolutely refused to pretend that coming under heavy artillery fire felt like heroic excitement. The establishment wanted tales of bravery, but Strahm just presented the terrifying, numb, shattered reality of an artillery barrage. His broken sentences mirrored the broken landscape.
But as much as poets like Strahm, Wilfred Owen, and Siegfried Sassoon redefined the entire genre for the 20th century, there is a massive historical blind spot we need to talk about.
Yes, the exclusion of noncombatants.
Right. From the end of the First World War right up until the 1970s, the war poet label was almost exclusively reserved for men who fought and died in the mud of the trenches. It was an incredibly narrow definition of authenticity that completely boxed out other experiences.
It excluded so many vital voices. Over 500 women published poetry during World War I. They were writing about the crushing anxiety of the home front, the deep grief of mourning a lost generation, and the visceral, blood-soaked reality of nursing the wounded.
But they were basically ignored.
Largely brushed aside and excluded from early literary anthologies because they didn't fit the soldier-poet archetype.
Which is ironic considering the medical side of the war gave us two of the most iconic cultural symbols of World War I. You have the Canadian surgeon John McCrae. He was treating the wounded during the horrific Second Battle of Ypres.
Just a bloodbath.
Absolute nightmare. After burying a close friend, he sat in a tiny 8-by-8-foot dirt bunker and wrote, "In Flanders Fields."
A poem that resonated so deeply it went truly global.
Right. It became so ubiquitous that it inspired an American poet named Moina Michael. She read McCrae's poem and was so moved by the imagery of the poppies blowing among the crosses that she established the tradition of wearing a red poppy year-round to honor the fallen.
It's amazing.
It is amazing how one short poem, scribbled in a dirt bunker between surgeries, shaped the way the entire globe handles memorial culture for a century.
It is a profound legacy, but World War I poetry also exposes the deep, messy political complications of the era. The Irish poets are a prime example of this tension.
Divided loyalties.
Exactly. Take Francis Ledwidge. He was a staunch Irish Republican who initially refused to enlist in the British Army, which makes total sense given the political climate in Ireland at the time.
But he ended up in a British uniform anyway. How did that happen?
He faced a brutal show trial by local Unionists who publicly accused him of cowardice. The pressure was immense. Ultimately, he joined the British military, but he made it very clear it wasn't out of loyalty to the British Crown.
It was a moral stance for him.
Right. He joined because he simply refused to let others defend European civilization from imperialism while he stayed comfortably at home.
And he tragically died at the Battle of Passchendaele. Then, on the other side of that coin, you have W.B. Yeats. He wrote An Irish Airman foresees his death about his friend, Major Robert Gregory.
But he didn't publish it right away.
No, Yeats actually withheld publishing that poem until after the 1918 armistice. He intentionally showed restraint, feeling it was inappropriate to publish such a highly nuanced, politically complex poem during the absolute height of a global conflict.
That incredible tension of divided loyalties only amplifies as we move forward in the timeline into the 20s and 30s.
It does. And this brings us to the Russian and the Spanish Civil Wars. Now, I want to take a second to speak directly to you, the listener, because the sources here deal with highly politically charged content from both left-wing and right-wing figures. We want to make it absolutely clear that we are not taking sides.
We are not endorsing any of these viewpoints.
Exactly. We are simply acting as impartial guides. We're reporting on the ideas and historical realities contained within the original source material to understand how humanity processes conflict.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, civil wars are uniquely devastating because they force writers to turn their pens and their weapons against their own countrymen. It fractures a nation's literary soul.
It turns neighbor against neighbor.
Exactly. During the Russian Civil War, the symbolist poet Marina Tsvedeva wrote an epic cycle of poems that essentially served as a diary glorifying the anti-communist White Army.
Meanwhile, on the exact opposite side of that brutal conflict, you have Osip Mandelstam. He was writing poems fervently praising the Red Army. But the profound tragedy of his story is that he truly believed a poet must be the unflinching conscience of the people. And that belief eventually cost him everything.
It really did.
Decades later, Mandelstam composed a short epigram that mocked Joseph Stalin's cruelty. And he died in a Soviet gulag simply for writing it.
We see that same intense, bitter divide during the Spanish Civil War. English-speaking poets actually traveled to Spain to volunteer and fight on both sides. On the nationalist side, you have the South African poet Roy Campbell.
The Catholic convert, right?
Yes, he was a recent Catholic convert, and he was absolutely horrified by the violence of the Republican forces, specifically the Red Terror. He discovered the bodies of Carmelite monks and Toledo men he had personally befriended, who had been executed in the street without a trial.
And the executioners had written, "Thus strikes the Cheka, in blood above the bodies of the monks."
Right, and just for context, the Cheka was the original Soviet secret police force, which heavily influenced the communist factions in Spain. So Campbell wrote furious poems detailing this horrific event, cementing his pro-nationalist stance.
But that had consequences for his legacy.
Huge consequences. Because he backed Francisco Franco's fascist-aligned forces, he was effectively blacklisted. He was deliberately left out of many subsequent poetry anthologies and university literature courses for decades.
Now, contrast Campbell's experience with that of his close friend, Uys Krige. Krige was an Afrikaner Calvinist, and he campaigned just as passionately, but for the opposing Republican faction. He wrote a furious Afrikaans poem that specifically condemned the bombing raids carried out by pro-nationalist Luftwaffe pilots.
And he didn't pull any punches with his imagery.
Not at all. Krige used a savage irony that mixed sacred Latin church liturgy with the violence of the mercenaries dropping bombs on civilians.
That's intense.
It built to a massive climax that openly mocked the crucifixion of Christ, essentially asking how the church could support a side dropping bombs from the sky. The outrage was immediate. Vehement condemnation poured in from the Catholic Church in South Africa, who called the poem deeply sacrilegious. It just goes to show how, in a civil war, poetry doesn't just reflect the battlefield.
It becomes a battlefield itself.
Exactly.
That is a crucial insight. But as the 30s bleed into the 40s, the tone of the poetry shifts yet again.
It really does. There's this fascinating observation from the American poet Richard Wilbur. He noted that the World War II poets felt fundamentally different from the World War I poets.
In what way?
Well, if World War I was defined by a sense of tragic futility, young men dying for nothing in the mud world war, two poets felt they were fighting a just war against terrible, fascistic enemies that absolutely had to be destroyed to save the world.
But believing a war is just absolutely does not insulate a poet from its horrors. The
Right.
difficulty of processing the sheer industrialized scale of civilian and military devastation in World War II was immense. Look at the Polish poet Anna Srzeczka.
Her story is incredible.
She served as a battlefield nurse during the 1944 Warsaw Uprising. Put yourself in her shoes. She witnessed a city of 1 million people fighting a desperate, doomed battle against Nazi tanks and heavy artillery for 63 straight days.
And the most striking thing is that it took her 30 years to figure out how to write about it.
Exactly. 30 years of silence on the subject. She tried for decades to put the uprising into verse, but she kept destroying her manuscripts. Everything she wrote felt too flowery, too wordy, or too pathetic compared to the brutal reality she had lived through.
So what did she end up doing?
She realized she had to strip everything away, even more than August Stram did in World War I. She published a collection of what she called unrhymed miniature micro-reports, just tiny, breathless, fragmented observations of a single horrific incident, because that was the only way the human mind could process that level of trauma without completely breaking down.
The psychological toll is just staggering to think about. And we see a similarly chilling attempt to process the dark ideology of the war from the Hungarian poet Miklos Radnóti. He was a vocal critic of both the fascist Arrow-Cross Party and the pro-German government.
He had a very specific view on totalitarianism.
He did. Radnóti believed that totalitarianism, whether fascism or communism, destroyed intricate, beautiful civil society in order to create what he called a criminally simple-minded order.
His analogy for this concept is one of the most haunting details we've come across.
It really stuck with me. He compared authoritarianism to wanting an ideal cat.
Yeah.
So imagine you take a real, living, breathing cat. You kill it, you strip away its flesh, you put it into an industrial mold, and you press it into the perfect uniform shape of a cat.
It's grotesque.
It's this visceral, horrifying image of how regimes crush the messy, beautiful reality of human life into a dead, artificial mold where everyone conforms.
And part of maintaining that dead artificial mold is strictly controlling the narrative. Which brings us to the profound theme of censorship in World War II poetry. We have the Japanese general Tadamichi Kuribayashi. He was the commander during the brutal Battle of Iwo Jima.
Right.
Knowing he was facing certain death against overwhelming American forces, he sent a farewell message back to Imperial headquarters, and he included 3 traditional waka poems.
Just to clarify, waka poetry is that classical Japanese format, right? The one with 5 lines and 31 syllables.
That's right. It's an ancient, highly structured form meant to convey deep emotion. But the poems he sent weren't the glorious, patriotic verses the military command wanted to hear. Historians view his waka poems as a subtle but incredibly firm protest against a military command that was so casually throwing the lives of its men away in unwinnable battles. He wrote about the profound sadness of his soldiers falling in battle far from home.
I'm guessing the Japanese military censors didn't just publish that in the morning paper?
Not at all. They couldn't allow a commanding general to express anti-war sentiment, so they heavily rewrote his death poems before releasing them to the public, completely altering his words to falsely claim that the soldiers died happily in suicidal banzai charges.
They hijacked his final words.
They hijacked his final words to feed the propaganda machine.
And we should note that censorship wasn't just happening on the Axis side of the war. Take Sadako Kurihara. She survived the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. She wrote a major collection of poems bearing witness to the unimaginable horrors of the nuclear blast.
But her work was suppressed.
Heavily censored by the American occupation forces in Japan because her poetry dealt too explicitly with the devastating, lingering reality of the nuclear fallout.
It proves time and time again that poetry holds a raw truth that authorities often find incredibly threatening. Which brings us right up to the present day. We are seeing these exact same dynamics, the trauma, the desperate need for truth, and the urge to bear witness, playing out in real time with Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine.
Yes, the timeline we've been tracking ends right in the middle of the digital age. We're seeing poetry respond almost instantly to the conflict. There is a heavy use of the sunflower motif representing Ukrainian resistance and national identity. You have prominent poets outside of Ukraine, like the UK poet laureate Simon Armitage, publishing new poems centered entirely on that imagery.
It's an immediate global response.
But even more fascinating to me is how the actual distribution of war poetry has evolved.
It is a massive leap. We've gone from the traveling minstrels of pre-Islamic Persia to digital Substack newsletters.
There's a digital space right now called Sunflowers in the Blood. It's a newsletter that curates and publishes war poetry, translations, and essays in real time. It's not waiting for a post-war anthology to be printed. It's being pushed straight into people's email inboxes as the artillery is literally firing.
It's an incredible shift in the medium.
Well, so what does this all mean? We've covered thousands of years of human history today, and if there's one glaring takeaway from all this material, it's that while the weapons change from bronze swords at Troy to mechanized tanks in Warsaw to nuclear bombs in Hiroshima, and the politics constantly shift back and forth, the fundamental human impulse remains exactly the same.
We still need to process it.
Yes. When faced with the absolute extremities of war, humanity instinctively turns to the rhythm, the structure, and the deep emotional truth of poetry. It acts as a constant anchor for our humanity when absolutely everything else is being blown apart.
This raises an important question, though. We've seen how war poetry relentlessly adapts its medium over time. We started with traveling minstrels singing ancient epics to crowds around a fire. Then we moved to printed pamphlets distributed in the mud of the Crimea. Then to radio broadcasts echoing through the siege of Leningrad. And now we are looking at algorithm-driven digital newsletters updating by the minute. If the old adage is right, and the medium truly shapes the message, how will the instantaneous, AI-driven, and hyper-fragmented platforms of the near future alter the very nature of war poetry? Will it lose its deeply personal human soul to the algorithms, or will the raw, undeniable necessity to write our way through trauma simply find a new, completely unimaginable format to break our hearts all over again?
That is a heavy but incredibly vital thought to leave you with today. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey through the history of how we process conflict. We appreciate you taking the time to explore this deep dive with us, and we'll catch you on the next one. Take care.